Hi, my name is Max. I'm a musician, producer, and long-year Frusciante fanboy, and today I want to talk about the production process of John Frusciante's album To Record Water for Only 10 Days. The album came out in 2001 and is a really special album, at least to me. It marks John's first record since his return to the Red Hot Chili Peppers in 1999. Also his first solo album since coming clean of his drug addiction. Contains many classic songs such as Ramparts, Murderers, Going Inside, and many others obviously. It's just a record that has a lot of character, I have to say. Like, seriously, there's not any other album that I can compare it to, really, production-wise. It's like still a lo-fi sounding record because John recorded the album at home with a digital multi-track recorder, but it's way more hi-fi compared to his previous releases like Neon Roller Death. The album makes use of drum machines and synthesizers while still having the classic simple guitar arrangements and classic songwriting elements in it. So it bridges a really interesting gap, I have to say. And yeah, it was recorded digitally and mixed analog, which makes it also interesting, but more on that later. Overall, it's a unique sounding record and I think it deserves to be talked about. So I want to specifically talk about the production process of this album because I got really obsessed with it somehow a few months ago. It just led me to doing some research how the album was made, and ultimately I recorded my own little EP with similar approach. The EP is, by the way, called Nights to Unglue. The link is in the description if you want to listen to it. Sorry for the shameless plug. But yeah, since I could not find a lot of people talking about Record Water for only 10 days, I thought I'd do it myself and share my insights that I found out. So I will go over different elements of the album and show how they were made, and also how they can be approached if you want to do your own recordings in a similar style. We'll start with drums, then do guitars, synths, and then the overall production process. So yeah, if you're in nerding out about this Frusciante album, then bear with me and let's go. Okay, let's start with drums, huge part of the record obviously. John used the AK MPC 3000, which is a legendary sampler sequencer from the 90s. And overall the drum sounds on this album are pretty gritty and warm and lo-fi. I could not verify from where exactly John took the drum samples, but what I read seems plausible to me that he maybe used the samples from the Nord Lead 2, which is a synthesizer that he heavily used and also heavenly used on this record, and ran them through the MPC 3000 for programming and coloration, and that way he got this really fat and gritty drum machine sounds. What does this mean now if you want to achieve a similar sound? Because most of us will probably not have this sequencer laying around. The easiest way, and what I partly did, is just to sample some of the drum sounds from To Record Water and make your own kit with it. Good starting points are the songs Representing or Murderers, for example, because they start with a kick and snare loop, so you can easily just grab the samples and get clean samples, and you don't have to mess around with any stem separation or that kind of stuff. So I just took the kick and snare samples from those songs and used them as a foundation to put together my own drum kit in Ableton. I would start with already quite processed and drum machiney sounding sample, and then just add compression and saturation for that drive and grittiness. And generally also don't be afraid to experiment with reverb. There is often a lot of reverb on snare and percussive elements, and also layering drum samples with some percussive, gritty, noisy sounds is also a good tip I can give, because there's a lot of those on this record. For example, here I took a snare sample, added compression and saturation, and layered it then with this percussive hit, and then it sounds like this. It's not any particular sound from the record because there are quite a few different sounds, drum-wise also, but it just gets you in the ballpark, and I think you can get inspired from there and create something in a similar style. At least that's always my approach. Of course, if you want to get like really super nitty-gritty, you can always, like, I don't know, do it more exact. Let's move on to guitars, which is probably the main point for most Frusciante fans. John recorded most of the album during the tour for Californication, so he used whatever guitars he had laying around. I read in an interview. So since his main guitars like the Strat or the Gretsch White Falcon were in storage for the tour, he just used what he had at hand at the times. He confirmed that in an interview with Guitar One from 2001 that I found. I can link it in the description. And in the interview he goes more in depth about the guitars. So for the acoustic parts, which you actually find surprisingly quite a lot on the record, he used an old Martin 018 that he borrowed from Anthony actually. And for the electric guitars he used a Gibson SG for some leads and mainly a Fender Mustang from 1966. And he said he also might use a Gibson L5 for something and a Fender Jaguar, and he thinks that Ramparts could be maybe a Strat. So there's pretty much everything on there. And there's a picture floating around on the internet from this time period where you can see some of the equipment John used for this album. You can see John holding the Martin guitar in this pic, and you can see the Mustang chilling in the back, as well as his main Strat from the Chili Peppers obviously, and a few other acoustic guitars. It's a really cool picture. So guitar-wise, yeah, there's pretty much everything on it. I think that gives a nice example that use whatever you have available and just unleash your creativity. Gear should not be a limitation. I think that's always a good sentiment. However, what is important for the guitar sound though is that John didn't use any amps or effects. He went directly into his digital mixer, and that causes this relatively dry and lo-fi sound that you will find across all of the album. So if you want to achieve a similar sound, I recommend just going directly into your interface, turn the gain up till you get a decent level of signal, and yeah, maybe it gets even a little bit of grit depending on what you want. And afterwards I also like to treat the guitars with a little bit of compression and saturation, and maybe some tape emulation if you like, further down the line in the mixing process. But yeah, overall the guitars on this album are really dry and simple, and yeah, I think there's not much more to say about the guitars. Let's move on to the synths. Okay, what I found out about the synths is that John mainly used Nord Lead 2 and a Casio SQ1. And you can see the Nord Lead 2 actually on the picture that I've shown before. It's also possible that John used other synths like a Solina string ensemble and a Korg MS-10, but I could not verify that. And yeah, it's likely that he used a few different things depending what he had laying around at that time. And obviously synths are a huge part of the record, and there are a lot of different sounds on the album, so it's difficult to pinpoint down one specific sound. However, it can be said that John was heavily influenced by 80s synth pop such as Depeche Mode and New Order. So yeah, if you look up a vintage 80s style synth pop sounds, you should be a good starting point. Generally speaking, there are a lot of string and pad sounds all over the record, so that's certainly something to crave for. I found useful the Spitfire Audio Labs vintage string collection. I used a bunch of synths from there. It's free. But obviously there are other countless possibilities for plugins. I think there are even particular emulations for the Nord Lead 2 if you really want to get super close. So that's all I can say about synths for now. Okay, let's talk about the production and the mixing of this record. So Frusciante did all the tracking into a Yamaha MD8 digital recorder, which is an early digital multi-track recorder that recorded into minidisc, which is a pretty obscure format looking at it nowadays, and probably it was not that great sounding. At least that's what John felt like. As he stated in an interview, when we came to mix that record, I realized how bad it sounded. After that album, I vowed that I wasn't going to record anything on digital digital anymore. So these are really some strong sentiments. And for that reason, all the tracks were bounced to tape and later mixed on a decent analog studio console. I find this really interesting and wonder what kind of processing exactly happened to John's digital recordings. But most likely it was run through some decent analog studio EQs and compressors to polish the record. And John also said in an interview at that time that he didn't know much about production. So all the levels on his initial mix on the Yamaha MD8 were way off balance wise. So he had a mixing engineer setting up the levels correctly and doing the mix for him essentially. Production wise, it's worth noting that there is a lot of saturation on everything, like seriously. And this really defines the record to me and makes it so interesting, because although there's a lot of artificial and computery sounds like drum machines and synthesizers on it, it still manages to keep the balance to feel human and warm and yeah, just not robotic at all. So the saturation and compression done to this record adds to this warm lo-fi character, I think. Especially if you listen to the vocals, for example, you can really hear the treatment that this record has become. So I think that's a huge part in achieving the sound of this record. And generally speaking, I think every stage of making a record matters in the end result. So in this case, starting with John recording into the Yamaha MD8, but it's also worth to say that it's likely that a lot of the treatment that happened then in the analog mixing part of the process, running the tracks through analog compressors and decent preamps to add this grip, played also a huge role, I think, in making this record. Also worth mentioning, production-wise, maybe there's a lot of reverb on some elements, especially the synths, but also sometimes the drums and vocals. So to make the mix full and wet. So that's also something to keep in mind to, not to produce too dry. Yeah, some practical tips maybe to achieve a similar sound. When tracking, just generally don't be too clean, don't be afraid to embrace the lo-fi aesthetics, I'd say, and keep this mindset till the mixing stage. I, for example, added in still some saturation plugins on the mix bus to achieve a bit more of this vibe. So yeah, go lo-fi, I guess. Also, what I did then in the mixing stage is to mix the record on an analog console and run it through that. So it adds a little bit of glue in the circuit, and I hope it emulates a little bit of this transferring to analog kind of thing that John did too. Obviously, it's not a fancy studio console or anything like that, but a bit of analog always helps in your recording chain. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about this record and the production around it. I really love it, and I think the vibe is extraordinary. And it was a lot of fun doing this research on the production of the whole thing. So I hope this was helpful or interesting to some of you. Links to my music where I try to recreate some of the aesthetics on my latest EP, Nights to on Glue, is below if you want to listen to that. Also Instagram or Fiverr if you need help with your music production. I do stuff there. And yeah, cool. See you in the next video, I guess. Bye.